And we are back again after a brief 40 minutes intermission. And I am absolutely stoked today to have Mario from Symbolic Studies on the Friday FARcast. I guess this is the last Friday FARcast of 2023. And I haven't had one in a couple of weeks because of all the moving. And it feels fitting to have you on today, Mario, because of some of the themes we're going to be talking about: Capricorn, Saturnalia, the goats, some Cancerian issues, the stuff you're doing with Libra, and just kind of bringing this Gregorian cycle to a close on this Friday. And so, thank you for being here. I'm really appreciative that you are here. And some of the folks probably saw the show that we did together with Ben and Longo. But for those of you who have not, let's introduce you to Mario, and let's get into your background a little bit as a designer and how you sort of stumbled into this world of decoding occult and esoteric symbolism.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me and giving me the opportunity to hang out with your audience. I'm prepped and ready to go. I have my Sea Goat Capricorn mug right here, and so I came prepared. But yeah, if people are unfamiliar with myself or my work, my project is called Symbolic Studies. So symbolicstudies.com is where people can find me. And I've been a graphic designer for 20 years now, over 20 years, actually. And I feel like I've always just been an artist, at heart. And so I've always been paying attention. I've always wanted to know how things were created. I've always illustrated. And once I started designing, it really gave me, I guess, just a chance to kind of dive into, the aesthetic world, right? Playing with colors, playing with textures, playing with different imagery. I've always been into photography as well. And so when I first started doing design work, it was really simple. And I, just started creating my own, um, you know, kind of like album covers and t-shirt designs and things like that for projects that didn't even really exist at the time. But it didn't really take long for me to start designing stuff for friends' bands. And so I was really plugged into the metal and punk and hardcore scene where I grew up in Central California. And that was a huge blessing for so many different reasons because it just gave me drive. It gave me something to look forward to. It gave me just an outlet, I guess, for my art. And over time, I wanted to know more about some of the symbols I was either coming across or starting to create on my own. I was always curious about even just the nature of different shapes, too. What's the nature of the circle? What's the nature of the square versus the triangle? Things like that. And at some point, I realized that you can actually buy books on symbolism. That was like a foreign concept to me. So I went to Borders one day. I remember coming across a book on symbols. I bought it, and it had, entries on all of these different animals, colors, things like that. And I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. I didn't know that you could actually just get into symbolism. And from there, I started collecting a lot of symbolic reference books, a lot of dictionaries, things like that. And I kind of got a lay of the land, over time. And from there, I just really wanted to dive into particular topics, subjects, specific symbols I wanted to know more about. And it wasn't until I was actually introduced to the tarot where things really, really opened up. Actually, a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to design a tarot website with him. And he had actually programmed the engine behind tarot.com that gave you readings. And so he was already familiar with that world. And he was like, I can do a better job than what I did the first time. And, we can give people readings. It'll be interesting. It could be our little side project together. And he said, if you're going to design this site for me, though, you need to know at least something about the cards. And so he went and purchased a handful of books on the tarot. Because I had been a lifelong artist and because I had gone to film school as well and was already kind of used to decoding scripts and short films, and I was behind the camera and I was doing lighting and I even acted in a few projects and stuff, I thought I understood symbolism. And then I opened this book and I realized I had a lot more to learn, that I really didn't know anything. And so the book I bought, or the book he gave me rather, the main deck that it was referencing was the Thoth tarot deck, the Crowley deck.
Right.
And the imagery really captivated me. I was curious about, the elemental correspondences with everything, the nature of water and air and fire and stuff like that. And I bought my first tarot deck, and it was kind of game over from there. I mean, it opened me up to mythology, psychology, color theory, numerology, occultism, all sorts of esoteric stuff. And so from there, I've just been going down all of these different rabbit holes, trying to just really build a solid symbolic foundation. And at some point, I realized I need an outlet for this. I need to kind of get some of this stuff off my chest. I realized I was consuming too much information about it, but I really wasn't projecting it out there. I wasn't doing anything with it. And so what I decided to do was create symbolic studies. And I basically figured that the best way to kind of build more of this foundation for myself was to just follow the signs of the zodiac, actually. And I'm like, this is just going to be the best groundwork I can create for myself. And so I think symbolic studies is maybe 3 or 4 years old now. And so since then, I've been following each sign during the sign itself, creating content and memes and short videos and things like that about the signs. And it's really cool too, because every single season, a new layer, a new veil is kind of lifted. Things are revealed to me that I didn't realize the previous season and the previous season. So I continue just building, my sort of awareness of all of these signs. And sure enough, with Capricorn and Saturn and everything else, I'm going through another cycle where there's new things that are coming to me that I'm excited to talk about.
Cool. I was just, I don't know if you saw it or not, but I had the Crowley um, deck up on the share screen,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is a tremendous deck. In terms of imagery, it's still one of my favorite decks.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've got it up on the screen now. I don't know if you can see it or not, but there are two versions of the Crowley deck. There's the one that most people have, and then there's another, which I believe is a Swiss version, which has 3 magicians in it, 3 separate renditions of the magician. And the color palette of the Swiss deck just really jumps. Are you familiar with the Swiss version of the Crowley deck?
I am. And actually, I got really lucky because I went to a used bookstore. They only had one copy of the deck. It was still in the box. It was opened. It was used. And it was that version. And it had all of the versions of the magician still
Right.
there.
Yeah. That was my first deck. Somebody actually had gifted that to me. And typical fucking Oakland, somebody broke into my van one day and took it.
Yeah.
And it was like,
Sounds about right.
I don't know, man. I had such, it's really weird too. I'd love your opinion on this. I've seen so many pieces online from people who use the Crowley deck, and all these terrible things happen to them in their life, according to them. And so they burned the deck and buried the deck. I never had anything bad happen to me. So what's your experience with the Crowley deck been like?
Oh, yeah. I've never had anything bad happen to me. I will say, though, my sort of my relationship with the tarot is almost like just it's a book, and so it's a book. It's a book of images. It's a book of symbols, and I generally treat them as such. And so my sort of bond with these decks, I would say, is more research oriented. I do give readings, and I do readings for myself and for friends and things like that. And so I have more of a psychological approach, I would say, with the deck versus, say, this magical, mystical sort of thing. I'm not the type of person that wants to do rituals. I'm not the type of person, I'm not the type of person that wants to do other people's rituals. I'm not a ceremonial magician or anything like that. I'm not creating sigils that I've read in a book to do some sort of spell or anything like that.
Right.
And so I think you can get a lot out of the tarot using it as a reference book, using it as a way to kind of dive into whatever sort of whatever energetic quality you want to know more about. There's so much contained in there that I found that the tarot really kind of grows with your awareness, with your consciousness. And so as you continue to grow as a person, I think that the tarot kind of aligns with you that way. And so I've never had anything weird or spooky. I have a lot of books that people would consider to be spooky or dark I wouldn't. I've had several times people have seen my book collection and they've said, "Oh, you have that around? Aren't you worried that, some ghost is going to come out and haunt you or, something along these lines?" And I'm like, I personally, I don't have that relationship with my books. It's very possible I'm aware of some occultists and what they do to their books before they publish them. That's kind of a whole interesting rabbit hole. But no, as far as I'm concerned, what I have here, I feel pretty protected and guarded, but it could just be how I tend to use it.
Yeah, I mean, that's my feeling as well. I think a lot of the material is, in my estimation, neutral. It's how you come at it and what type of consciousness you bring to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's just been my experience, pretty much in general.
Yeah, I feel that.
Okay. Let me adjust my mic here.
Go for it.
One of the books that I was looking up when you were talking about symbols is Jung's Man and His Symbols. That book changed my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've read that one.
Yeah. I mean,
that was really interesting when I checked it out too. It gave me a lot to chew on.
Yeah, that thrust me into like a parallel dimension with just the depth. And I think that was like a compendium of a lot of his written work later in life. Sort of like it wasn't like a best of compilation, but I think that's how they pulled that together. But it was really, really well done. So here we are in Scorpio season. I'm sorry, Capricorn season. Sometimes Capricorn feels like Scorpio. To me, those two signs. I'd love your take on this. When I think of Capricorn and Scorpio, not that they're interchangeable, but some of the dynamics that they share together are very interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh man, I've been thinking about this a bit lately, and to me, I told my fiance the other day, I'm like, obviously, we have the day side of the zodiac, right? Aries through Libra, Libra through Pisces being the night side of the zodiac, the dark side of the zodiac. And I see a Saturnian relationship with basically everything through, arguably, honestly, Libra through Aquarius, right? Mm-hmm. So Saturn is exalted in Libra. Then you have Scorpio, obviously its relationship to death and everything else. That makes a lot of sense. And then you have Sagittarius, its earthiness, a lot of older illustrations of Sagittarius. I love the fact that oftentimes he has horns. It's not uncommon for older versions of Sagittarius too to be fighting a demon. I made a post about this not too long ago. Some like Middle Eastern Arabic influenced Sagittarius illustrations. It shows the archer actually shooting his arrow at his tail, which has a demon head at the end of it. So he's looking behind him and he's shooting his own tail, which has this demonic head on it. And so there's a number of hybrids, that come with Sagittarius, and Capricorn, the sea goat too, is obviously a hybrid. So there's a big relationship I see between Sagittarius and Capricorn as well. And this nature god sort of thing, fertility and things like that, even abundance and whatnot. And then also too, Aquarius, its old rulership was Saturn itself. And so from Libra to Aquarius, I see a lot of Saturnian symbolism, right there, which makes a lot of sense to me.
When you look at the screen, am I frozen right now, or can you see me?
You are frozen to me, but that's not uncommon for my internet connection.
No, it's so I have a glitch with this computer.
Oh,
and unless I physically tap out, I will be frozen for the rest of. Hold on, let me reload the site, see what happens.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here if you're hanging out. I know this is streaming to my channel as well. So if you're hanging out on Symbolic Studies, thanks for being here. I don't know if we're going to get into it, but I mentioned the horns of Sagittarius, and horn symbolism is really appropriate right now to talk about with Capricorn. So it being a symbol of power, and then there's a correspondence with the horn and corn, right? So Capricorn, cornucopia, things like that. And so that's something that we'll probably get into here in a minute, but hopefully he comes back. And there he
Should
is.
be good. So every now and then I have
loading slowly on my end. I don't know if you can hear me, but at the
you're good. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. I can hear you now and see you now.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that connection between Sagittarius, who almost looks like Pan.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
And when we think of Pan, we also think of the goat god.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this very interesting interzone between these kind of chimeric images, and they represent something slightly different, but they are related, and it is really fascinating. And even when you look at Chiron, who is a centaur, right? Chiron's a centaur as well. And when we see the centaurs, they have horns, right? I
Yes.
mean, they're like horned entities. Do you have any sense as to how through the zodiac these two images from a natural perspective kind of morph? Do you see like anywhere in time where they become more solidified in their presentation?
That's really an interesting question. So actually, before I get to that, so chimera, I have it written down here in my notes because I just recently read it, but apparently chimera, the original translation of chimera comes from she-goat. And so I think that's really interesting. And when you look at the traditional chimera, it's actually it's a goat, and then it's a serpent and it's a lion together. I don't know if you've ever seen that together. It's a really, really interesting.
I've seen that image. Yeah, I have.
Right. So even with the chimera, the standard sort of chimera, when people are talking about a specific chimera, there's a goat right there. And I believe the goat, oftentimes its head is kind of in the back of the neck of the lion. The lion's body is kind of like the main aspect of it. But, you know, your question kind of weaves into a larger thing that I wanted to get into today. And it has to do with primordial gods. It has to do with ancient gods, really old gods, right? And so when you're talking about Saturn, obviously you're talking about things related to Father Time, Kronos, Saturn. I personally, just to kind of give you a little bit of a background of where I come from symbolically and astrologically, I get a lot out of studying the signs. I get a lot out of studying the symbolism of the signs. I get a lot out of following the signs themselves. Usually I follow things tropically, personally. But I'm not so much I'm not someone who's in the weeds with natal charts, you know, and things like that. And like yourself, you know, you're a wizard with astro weather and things of that sort. So I kind of have more of a, I don't know, I think it's more of a broader sort of approach with everything. And maybe it's more archetypal, if you want to put it that way. And so that's just kind of where I come from with my kind of research and everything. But I think what we're talking about is, you know, these older gods, these older sort of nature gods, Saturn. So the other thing that I would say about my personal approach is I tend to follow a traditional 7 planetary system as well. So I tend to think about Saturn being the furthest out, right? This lumbering, slow planet, obviously associated with lead, associated with the color black, you know, all of these different types of things, making one transit in 28 years, 29 years, or whatever it is.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So it taking a really, really long time to make one full transit versus, say, Mercury, which is 88 days, right? So that's a huge, huge contrast between the two. And I've seen a lot of interesting symbolism between these two planets too, and how they play off of each other. You know, Saturn nowadays being viewed as, essentially kind of feeding off of the youth, right? Saturn eats his children, sort of thing. Saturn being not wanting to be overthrown, right? So he eats his children in order to prevent that from happening.
Right.
And so Saturn, to me, kind of this new thread that I'm pulling at right now. It seems as though Saturn really is hearkening back to an older sort of possible system of time, even. And so it being related to time, I think that a lot of the symbolism that I'm picking up right now has to do with Saturn actually being a deity that was viewed more favorably back in the day, potentially during a golden age, and that at some point after this golden age has transitioned to a different age, a darker age, that Saturn sort of reverence and the abundance and the fertility and all these different things that are associated with it. Pan means all, as an example,
right. Yeah.
Right? And so at some point, it seems to me like, and I don't know if you agree with this, I'd love to know your opinion, but it seems to me like Saturn, the symbolism associated with Saturn became way more malefic at one point, and it became way darker, right?
I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
and,
go ahead.
No, I mean, I just, look back at my own experience in my youth and living in California, and not really knowing a whole lot about astrology. I must have been about, 22 or something like that. I knew a little bit, but not hardly anything at all.
Mm-hmm.
And people would ask me, well, how old are you? And I said, well, I'm 22 or 23. And then the Saturn return would come up. I had no idea what they were talking about. And they spoke about the Saturn return in such a way that it was almost apocalyptic, right? And that really front loaded my Saturn return. And that because there was a point where I started to learn a lot more about astrology. So I knew when it was coming, I knew when it was upon me, and I could not shake those voices in my head because they weren't my teachers, but they were certainly people that were older than me and theoretically knew something about astrology that I didn't know because they had gone through their Saturn return. And the way it was described to me was completely malefic. And looking back on that time, it became a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is where I have Saturn in Capricorn. So I've, come to learn to really appreciate it. Mm. And the astrological community has vilified Saturn and vilified Capricorn in a lot of ways. And I just think, well, hold on, we got to rethink this thing, right? We have to flip our awareness around, what this influence, what this archetype means to us. And getting back to I really want to pick your brains on sort of the personification, the deification of Saturn. But when we were on Longo's show, one of the things that I brought up was a period of time when Saturn was considered to be the sun of the solar system, and that it did give life, and it was a very central point of focus, and it was a very different world, a different kind of light. Supposedly, it was more ultra, like purplish, kind of magenta. That the world was kind of cloaked in this interesting, almost UV light, and there was a great deal of vegetation and high oxygen levels, like a real golden age in a lot of ways, that was associated with Saturn. Mm-hmm. And now the script is flipped with Saturn. In a lot of ways, if that is true, it negates the fact that we live during a time where this thing that has become this outpost of darkness and fatality was really a benefic.
Right. Yeah. That's my understanding. And you're probably referencing like Immanuel Velikovsky and that kind of work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I do remember you saying that, and that is my understanding as well. Is that there was a flip, and this gets into something that I've been very, very, very interested in over the last, I would say, more so heavily, like 3 or 4 years. Is this idea that there was a flip from a polar-based symbolic spiritual system to a solar-based system. Now, there's something to be said about lunar symbolism as well, and a lunar sort of way of reckoning time and understanding time, obviously. And so, for the purposes maybe of this conversation, I'll talk about the larger sort of switch from polar to solar. But it seems as though there have been several major symbolic ages. So, at the very least, 2 or 3 major symbolic ages. Currently, it seems as though we live in a very solarized age, kind of a solar paradigm or a solar world. Previous to that, I think that it makes a lot of sense that there was more of a lunar age, a lunar sort of understanding of reality and of time, and the moon being the primary timekeeper. A lot of words that we have that relate to time come from the moon. A lot of words that we use to measure things like month, right, come from the moon. Even like minute comes from the moon. That's my understanding. A lot of words that are M vowel N relate back to the moon. Even man, right? So man, menstruation, many, many things, which menstruation itself, it's a period, as in a period of time, right? It's a timekeeper. Right. And so it seems like previous to that, though, that the earliest age was a polar age. Now, this gets kind of confusing for people. It confused me for several years, but now I have a much better understanding of it because so many people have called it different things over time. So some people have referred to this as the polar tradition. Some people have referred to this as the northern tradition. I'm reading an author right now that I'm very interested in right now. His name is Rene Guénon. He calls it the primordial tradition. It's also referred to as the Hyperborean tradition. So it seems as though, to me, what at least Guénon is saying in one of the works that I'm reading right now of his, is that the earliest age, the spiritual age, the root of kind of what we're living in right now, this golden age was more of a Hyperborean age. It was a polar age. So it was this understanding that there is a supreme center, that there's a supreme center to the universe. There's a supreme center, or there's a sacred center to Earth. And then obviously there's a center to self. And everything symbolically also has a center to it. So when you think about a wheel, as an example, a wheel can't function without its axle, right? And so this gets into symbolism related to what's referred to as the world axis, or the axis mundi. I'm not sure if you've ever looked into it, but it's this idea that there is essentially a bridge or symbolic axle from the North Pole to the pole star, basically.
The axis mundi, yeah.
The axis mundi, right? Exactly. Yeah. And so this idea that humanity came from the north, migrated away from the north, this is a deep-seated, encoded, esoteric thing in a lot of religions, actually. And that when different groups have holy lands and they have a pilgrimage site, symbolically, what they're, I think, implying, or what the deep-seated message is that they're going back to the north. And it's really interesting that this is the case. Narco Longo, we riff on this kind of stuff a bit because he has this idea that, Florida was the Garden of Eden, right? So this northern location was often viewed as very, very Edenic, as something of a paradise. It was utopia. You know, the Garden of Eden story, even if you look at paintings of the Garden of Eden, you will see that tree with a serpent wrapped around it. That tree is, to me, emblematic of the world axis, essentially. Right. And so many symbols relate to this world axis. And so it seems as though this world axis, this reverence for it, for this center, right, was of primary importance. And so that's why some authors refer to this as the primordial sort of tradition. The thing that's blowing my mind right now is that it seems as though Saturn was the deity during this Hyperborean age, during this age where people had this reference for the north and had a reference for the center. So it's my understanding, I've read a few books about this now, that the perhaps original timekeeper in the skies, the original sky clock, was actually right around the North Star, and you are actually following Ursa Major and Ursa Minor going around the pole star. And
Right.
Ursa Major was almost kind of like, the hand of a clock going around, and it makes one spin throughout the year. And the symbolism and the mythology related to Ursa Major, which is the Dippers, right, the Great Bear, is absolutely staggering. It's completely mind blowing. And what's kind of surprised me actually is how many esoteric groups, modern esoteric groups, actually acknowledge this Hyperborean northern sort of tradition. And so Saturn being related to that, I think makes a lot of sense. I'll give you one example that I think kind of like, in a way, it doesn't necessarily bring it all together, but there's so many different threads we can pull at right now. But one of them that I wanted to mention was the idea that, Saturn oftentimes is related to a black cube, that the black cube is something that, is related to Saturn, right? And there's all these black cubes, around the world. There's one in New York City, and people have made a thing about it. It seems like it was kind of more popular to talk about a handful of years ago. But I do think that symbolically, it does make sense that this black cube is actually related to Saturn. Well, one of the things in the primordial northern polar tradition is that a lot of groups who practice a rite of circumambulation, of a dance going around a central point of pivot, what they're actually doing is, from my estimation and from what I've read from a number of sources now, is they're mirroring the heavens. They're actually mirroring the stars going around the pole star, which is, the North Star. And so when you see, as an example, there's some Native American groups where you dance around a central fire.
The sun,
literally,
the sun dance as well with the poles, right?
Right. Yes.
That's interesting.
Yes.
It's a pole, like a pole star.
Exactly. The maypole. You go around the maypole, right?
Right.
In voodoo, one of the things that's kind of been interesting to me is a lot of voodoo temples have a central pole, and there's a spiral wrapped around it. And they acknowledge this as essentially the world axis. They call it the navel of the universe, or the navel of the world. And so naval symbolism plays a big part in world axis symbolism. And so there are some native tribes that openly acknowledge that when we dance around a fire, we are dancing around the pole star. We're emulating Ursa Major, the seven stars of enlightenment going around this central star in the heavens. And I even have in another book, and I believe this is more of a northern indigenous group, where they openly acknowledge that their circular hut, their circular home, the fact that they put the fire in the middle and that there's a hole at the top of their dome of the home, that hole is symbolic of the throughway out of the universe, or out of this domain. And so it's been said that the stairway to heaven, or the point of ascension, literally is at the north. And so the stairway to heaven exits through the northern sky, basically, is what's been said many, many times over. And that their home, their circular home, is cosmological. It's cosmographical. That they're saying that if the structure of the heavens, in that if the stars are circumambulating around this central star, that circular nature, if that's good enough for the gods and good enough for these stars, it's good enough for us. So there were a lot of groups that actually had a circular structure to their village, where they would have a central totem, whether it would be a tree or a mound or a standing stone or something along these lines. And then there would be concentric rings emanating out from it. And people would live in different quadrants, actually, that extended out from this central place, right? And so this idea of a ringland system, I think of Lord of the Rings. And
Right.
It's interesting that Saturn has a big ring around it, right?
Right.
That this ringland sort of structure was more of this ancient primordial way of basically, structuring everything. It's almost like a ripple, a ripple in water, or it's almost like the rings of a tree, right? That you have the sacred center in the middle. It kind of reminds me of Atlantis, right?
Right. Yeah.
The three rings of Atlantis, so it's been said by Plato and things like that. And then things kind of emanate out from there. But this circumambulation, it's not uncommon for people to have that central totem, which sometimes is a stone, or in the case of Islam, is a black cube. And so you go to Mecca, and then you go around the Kaaba cube 7 times. So the number 7 comes up quite a bit in the primordial northern polar tradition, which is also, I would say, has been referred to as the stellar tradition as well. So that's kind of another variant of that. But I think that when people go and they go to a pilgrimage site and they are circling that central point, I think that that's what they're emulating. And it seems as though Saturn has been closely connected to these older traditions and where these traditions actually come from.
When you were talking about this sort of movement towards the north, right? The thing that popped into my head is what's going on with migration right now. And you have these hordes of people moving up from the south and into the north, right? And so we think about this as political theater. We think about this as the weaponization of population. But when you talk about it in the terms that you're talking about it, it takes on a completely different light, right? It becomes a symbol of this larger kind of migratory pattern, through the top of the axis mundi and out of this realm and into the next. So it's another way of looking at what's going on, and perhaps maybe a bit more redemptive to some degree.
Wow, that's actually really interesting, and you're hitting on a thread that's fascinating to me. And it's in a way, it's like weaponized directional symbolism, I guess you could say. Because what I've also noticed is this idea of manifest destiny, of going west, is a lot of the things that were encoded with the campaign of man moving west, right, and developing the West and going to the West and going to California and the Oregon Trail sort of thing. That I've seen propaganda like paintings and things like that encouraging people to go westward, and the symbolism that I see, I'm like, man, this just reminds me of a northern pilgrimage, but the thing I'll say is that a lot of groups around the world, they have their idea of what the center of the world is, right? So you ask a Jewish person, what's the center of the world? They're going to have their opinion. You ask someone in South America what the center of the world is, they're going to have their opinion. So a lot of people have a center of the world or a navel of the world kind of idea with their culture. And actually, this is very, very healthy in my estimation, that I think it makes sense to have something that you want to fight for, that you want to defend, that gives you a purpose. The world axis and a lot of symbols that relate to it, it usually, in so many ways, it relates to tradition, it relates to stability, it relates to foundation. There's order, and that's the thing too, is that this central star in the heavens gives order to the whole entire sky, basically, because all of the stars, excluding the wandering stars, revolve around this point, right? And so a lot of people have this idea that in their backyard, that was the center of the world. Their Adam and Eve came from that location, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that this is healthy, but there's so much confusion and there's so much debate about, no, this is Atlantis or that's Atlantis, or this is where Eden actually was. No, that's where Eden was. They're all right. They're none, in a way, none of them are wrong. I think they're all right to some degree, because what they're all actually doing is they're mirroring this original center, which is that metaphorical, I don't know. But when you look into symbolism, the symbol of the center is really interesting because, again, it's the point of origin. It's where everything comes from, but also returns to. And so in that way, it kind of reminds me of the Taurus field too. That Taurus field right in the middle, things emanate from the Taurus field, but then it also returns back to the Taurus field as well.
Right. Interesting. What are your thoughts on Game of Thrones? Because when I think of Game of Thrones, I think of this whole idea of the North again, right? And it's Hyperborean. It's out of any kind of temporal, space-time reference that, that we can kind of relate to it, right? And it's almost always perpetual winter in Game of Thrones. What are your thoughts on that as kind of a symbolic representation of a time that you're talking about?
Right. That's a good question. To be honest with you, I've only seen a couple of episodes, so I haven't done a deep dive or anything, but a number of people have told me, oh yeah, like some of what you're interested in, like you would get a lot out of, how they play with this dynamic. Is my understanding, do some are there nefarious beings and things like that come from the North as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that I find to be really, really fascinating too, is this idea that this northern opening, according to some occultists, black magicians, if you want to call them that, like Kenneth Grant, they say in their material, and I dove into it to get more of a northern understanding of things, that they basically have the same idea or the same framework, that that is the center of the vault of heaven or the firmament or whatever you might want to say, and that this is the exit point. It's also the entry point. And so therefore beings from other dimensions, from other realms, return or come through that gateway. And they actually associate this on the Kabbalistic tree of life with the hidden Sephiroth, which is Doth, which sounds close to death and is also
Right.
related to Thoth. And sometimes that Sephiroth is not there, but it's on that central line, right? So in the Kabbalistic tree of life, there's three pillars. That central pillar is the pillar of transcendence, though. It's the throughway. And so that Sephiroth Doth is actually very, very controversial in some circles. If you bring this up in some traditional Kabbalistic settings or whatever, they're not having it. It's very, very taboo to talk about it. But it's actually the entry point to dive into the clip-off, which would be the dark side of the tree of life, the tree of death, if you will. And so literally the root system of the tree of life, it's not visible. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but the tree of life doesn't have a clear root system. It kind of looks top heavy, like you could just fall over or something like that.
Right.
But the root system is actually there, but you have to go through Doth in order to access it. And then when you're looking at that tree, you're actually looking at the reversal of the tree of life. And so everything is completely inverted. And so, so the north being this opening for other things to kind of come through, I do find that to be interesting. I'm sure if I watched the show, there'd probably be a million things that I would pick up. I've actually been surprised going down this rabbit hole, though, how many movies make references to this. I think it was The Golden Compass kind of blew my mind a little bit, right. Because there's lots of northern symbolism in it, and there's an actual compass. And where do compasses point? They point north,
right.
You know? And so to me, that's a very interesting thing, which I've made videos about before, about this idea of the compass actually having a spiritual sort of correspondence with it. Because the other thing I'll say is that when I reference the north or the center, I think there's a correspondence with what I call your true north, right? So your center and your guiding star.
Right. Excellent point. Old World Micmac threw this up here. Got was great for 7 seasons. Of course, Got being Game of Thrones, right? And when we go to Got, it sounds a lot like goat, right?
Yeah, right.
And then 7 is part of the Saturn cycle.
Yes.
Right. Which is divided up into basically 4 sevens. And it's like, oh, well, that's interesting.
Right.
Yeah. And I was looking, I was looking up some facts on goats before the show.
Mm-hmm.
And goats, I did not know this, but goats are born usually with twins. Were you aware of that?
Oh, no, that's new to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh.
It's very common for goats to be born with twins. And if they're not born with twins, obviously it'll be 1 or it'll be 3, right? So if they're not a twin, it'll be a 1 or a triplet.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. And the life expectancy of a goat is half a Saturn cycle, right around 14 to 15 years.
Ooh, that's interesting too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. No, goats are fascinating creatures. My fiance, she's a Capricorn sun, and so she has a reverence for the goat, and because of her, I feel like my awareness of some Capricornian, Saturnian things, really came online because of our relationship. But yeah, I mean, the goat, the thing I've been thinking about lately, has to do with its horns and the power of having horns. And I was saying when you had to reload or whatever, that the horn, is symbolic of power, right? And According to, some researchers, the horn is also symbolic of the world axis, that the individual horn is a world axis symbol. And even the Egyptians referred to the opening at the north as the horn of a great bull, which I think is really interesting. So it was almost kind of like this opening, right? This kind of cusp, or this kind of cone, if you
Right.
will. And so
Right.
horn symbolism has been related to the north as well. And then the fact that the goat is such a amazing climber, right? It's ascending that mountain. To
It's
me,
incredible.
mountain symbolism,
Yeah.
it goes back to a central mountain,
Right.
basically, right? So Mount Meru or what have you. I am familiar with the Bach saga. Yeah, so Bach means goat, I'm pretty sure, right?
Yeah, I think it does mean goat, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another story of the North as well,
Mm-hmm.
with
Mm-hmm.
the Bach saga. Yeah, goats are fat. They're as creatures, they're absolutely fascinating, and they're finding out now that goats have a particular fungi in their. They've got four stomachs, just like cows do, but they have a particular fungi in their stomach, along with bacteria that does something to their waste products that is like supposedly not CO2 based, right? Like they've got like magic fungi in their digestive system. And somebody just did a paper on this recently. And like this is what science does. Like, well, how can we exploit that and turn that into some kind of useful product so that we can break down CO2 in our own environment? It's like, just let the goat have its own stomach, okay? Just leave it alone, right?
Right.
We don't have to do anything with it. You brought up an interesting thing around the bull and the horns and the opening. And so here we have a sea goat image behind me, which we can talk more about that. But there's also imagery around the sea bull or the quinotar. And supposedly the founder of the Merovingians, Merovec, is the byproduct of the marriage between a quinotar and his terrestrial mother, right? So we see these images of these agrarian animals, not just the goat, but the bull having this connection to the sea as well. What are your thoughts around this quinotar idea?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked into it in depth like I have some other hybrids, but I've always found it interesting. I remember the first time actually I saw it, I'm like, "Whoa, this is surprising." It was one of the ones that kind of caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting to see that quite like that. But the bull, man, what can be said about the bull? The bull was actually my first love symbolically, I'll say. It was my first animal that I really, really got into. So Taurus symbolism and things of that sort. And the bull seems to be something of, and there's a lot of animals and symbols that are kind of like this, but the bull is like a bridge. The bull is a bridge between different religions. Even Manly P. Hall in the Secret Teachings of All Ages. I've made videos about this before as well, but the first plate he has in Secret Teachings is called A Group of World Religions. And he's showing small scenes. They're all kind of put together in one larger scene. But he's showing scenes from Islam and from Mithraism and also from Christianity and from from ancient Egypt and things like that. And he's placing bulls everywhere. So he's showing Taurus in the sky. He's showing the golden calf. He's showing Mithras slaying the bull. He's showing the Apis bull from Egypt, right? And so basically what he's saying in this work is that the bull connects all of these religions. And similarly, I would say, kind of like what we're talking about with Saturn, it seems like the same thing happened with the bull, that it was more of a positive sort of god or animal. And then at some point, it seems like things kind of got flipped. So, I mean, the basic understanding that I have is that a lot of gods, a lot of animals, when their age is over, their symbolism kind of goes with it. And so they end up being sacrificed, as an example. They end up being more of a sacrificial animal. They end up, a lot of times, they become more masculine instead of feminine. I think that's kind of interesting. When you go to India, you see their reverence for the bull, and it's more feminine, in nature. It's referred to as like the second mother of mankind, right? And so the bull kind of seemingly connects everything. And also, there's a reason why I brought up the Taurus field earlier. Why do we call it a Taurus field? I think that's very curious. I think that's a really interesting sort of thing. So, the bull has been referred to as the bull of heaven and all that kind of stuff. So, to relate it, I think, with watery symbolism is very intriguing. It does remind me almost. It's not an exact parallel, but it reminds me a lot of the sea goat, sort of
Right.
imagery. And my understanding too is that a lot of watery symbolism, a lot of sort of the creatures that lurk in the depths of the ocean and everything else, that a lot of primordial gods are related to water, right? So even Lovecraft, Cthulhu comes from the ocean, right? He's lurking underneath the ocean depths and everything else. And so I actually think a lot of older sort of like adversarial figures like devils and stuff came from the ocean. And so there's a reason why Poseidon, as an example, has a trident, and the devil has a trident. I think that this sort of hybrid between goat and sea creature is kind of a recall of that, or it's almost kind of like residue of this sort of idea that potentially the adversary comes from underwater and that hell actually was underwater, not necessarily underneath the earth. But yeah, to just answer your question just plainly, as the bull and this sea creature hybrid, I would need to do more research, but those are a few of the things just kind of off the top of my head that kind of come to mind. It's a combination of the earth and of water, which both of those elements are would be the feminine elements traditionally. So fire and air, right? More masculine, related to the upward triangle, and then earth and water being related to the downward triangle, being more receptive.
Okay, so let's track this a little bit.
Sure.
We have the bull, representative of a particular epoch, era of time, and then to some degree, perhaps later demonized, bull, Baal, child sacrifice, things like that. Then we get into Saturn, right? Or who knows where it is in the sequence, but we have Saturn. We have Saturn as a benefic. Saturn maybe pertaining to this idea of the goat or the sea goat, and then at a particular point in time becomes a malefic. So where are we now in that continuum? What do we venerate now? And moving into the future, what will that thing be denigrated as?
Yeah, I mean that's a really, really interesting question. Certainly, these days, it almost I almost feel like all of these, when I think about the solar age as an example and the solarization of things, and I think about the lunar age, and I even think about the polar age, because that's kind of the framework that I'm working with right now. They all exist right now, right? So it's not like one has completely gone away. There's remnants of the polar age, I would say, the Hyperborean thing. There's remnants of lunar symbolism, and even obviously like Islam and Judaism, they still follow like a lunar calendar, so it's like that's what they're going by. So they haven't even made the complete switch over to like a solar sort of system, right? And so that's a fantastic question, man. I don't know. Part of me wants to say technology, is kind of the thing that people, it's almost like you worship what you do in a lot of ways, and a lot of people are spending time online, they're spending time on their phone, they're on social media, things like that, and that's more of a fairly recent sort of thing. So to me, I guess what I see is that I see a lot of sun symbolism right now.
That's where I was going. That's where I was going to go with it. Yeah. And then also, so we're talking about Sun, Leo, Lions, right? And at some point, will they become symbols of darkness, right? Like, will they look back in this time and say, well, these people were egoic, right? These people thought that they, it was their pride, right? We think of lions and pride, and it was their pride that kept them from being able to create a more holistic community. Which is terrible because I don't want to see the lion being demonized. I love lions. I think they're great. but to your point, I could see that happening.
Yeah, I can see that happening too. And this is how I tend to see it. So I think in the solar age, one of the things that's happened is, I'll start actually with the polar age. like I was saying earlier, with your sacred center, with your Eden, with your paradise, it was in your backyard. It was a place you could actually travel to, right? And during this age, it seems as though there was a big reverence for the earth itself, literally the soil you walk on. And I think that the fixed stars played a bigger role as well. In
Yes.
particular,
Yeah.
the stars right around the pole star. So Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, and even a Draco too, to an extent for sure. And so to me, when I think of this symbolism, I think of going within. I think of things that are regional. I think of things that are local. I think of sovereignty. I think of independence. I think of being concerned with what is happening in your backyard and not necessarily what's happening around the world, or maybe what's happening for some people in outer space or in different systems and different planets and things like that. As things have flipped to a more solar age, I see people basically kind of like the migration away from the pole, the migration away from their center, the migration away from their own pole, from their true north, from their North Star. And everything tends to be kind of externalized. So you want external validation, you want external answers, all of these different types of things. So it's a removal of self. To me, I see that as a large sort of thing that's happening in the solar age. And so I think that I could see things flipping back to self, to who you are, what you're about, what your actual, thoughts are, your own sort of, your essence and your spirit, versus being primarily concerned with what everyone else is doing, going along to get along and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. When I think of the solar age too, I think of Hollywood, and I think of actors and actresses, and the deification of these people that play roles, right? And taking us out of our own particular role playing or the expression of our spirit, right? And Hollywood is dying. Movies are dying. That whole quote unquote star system is dying. So, clearly we're leaving that behind. And there are some good things about it and some not so good things about it, because I do like movies, and I do like really good movies. And I hope that at some point we can begin to make them once again with a different kind of emphasis, without the social handcuffs that have been put on that whole process. But that's a really fascinating topic to tackle, the end of an age, and how we'll look back on the age and what symbols will be demonized as a result of the I don't know, sort of the degradation or the lack of conscious awareness during that time.
Right.
That's not to say that during a polar period that existed, because we don't really know, right? We don't really know how people during that culture viewed themselves amidst the backdrop of that culture. We could only speculate. But what do you think? I have my own theory, which I'll save. But what do you think brought the end of the polar age?
Excellent question. Yeah, I don't really know. I know that it was just it seems to be a migration away from this center, and so what caused that? Yeah, I'm not really sure. I know there's different theories out there about what perhaps caused it, but certainly, obviously, there must have been some sort of shift in awareness or consciousness that got people to even consider moving away, from that center. I'll bring this up because I think that one of the sort of myths that fits with this migration away from the north or from the pole is actually the Tower of Babel. And I think that the Tower of Babel story is encoding this in some ways, because the Tower of Babel was built after the flood. So this was the first civilization post-flood. And I look at all this stuff as, is it historical? Is it mythological? It's like I'm getting something out of it regardless. So I'm not, putting my sort of like flag in the ground and saying this is exactly what happened or anything like that. I find it useful. But there was a unified language post-flood. and the people who built the tower were able to communicate with each other. It's interesting that the tower too, this was modeled after the ziggurat, which they're known for having 7 tiers. They're known for having 7 stories. And I was actually reading some very interesting stuff from Tracy Twyman about the ziggurat and the nature of the tower and everything else. And she's been a big influence over me for a number of years now. And she was linking this.
She was in the Portland area. Did you know her?
I wouldn't say that I knew her, but we had met a couple times, and so I was able to chat with her and all of that kind of stuff. But no, we were by no means like on a first name basis or anything like that. But was lucky enough to be able to have some conversation with her. I brought up bull symbolism because at that time I was like going crazy about bull stuff, and then she put some really wild bull stuff in her last book too, which kind of blew my mind. But she was actually talking about the Tower of Babel and how it relates to the Merovingian bloodline, which was a huge thing for her as well, the Holy Grail mythos and all of that. And she was saying that these ziggurats were actually color-coded. These 7 stories were color-coded. And so it was acting as something of a rainbow bridge, right? And so tower symbolism relates to world axis symbolism in that world axis symbols, whether it's the tree, whether it's the mountain, the tower, the standing stone, they act as a bridge between the above and the below. They act as a bridge between heaven and earth, essentially. And what do you know? The people who were building the tower, that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to create a bridge to the heavens, right? And they were creating a rainbow bridge, which is why it was color-coded like that. And so God thwarted their plan. God did not like what they were up to because there was, I think, depending on sort of the translation, that they were trying to usurp God's power. They were trying to take over. They were trying to store the gates of heaven, basically. And so they're trying to take over themselves. And so they wanted to possess what God had. And so they were creating this tower. He thwarted their plan. And so he basically struck the tower down. And once people kind of like came out of this sort of experience, everyone had a different language. And so nobody was able to communicate with each other. So they all spread. And then apparently that's how the world got populated with different languages and different cultures and things like that. But it's interesting that the tower, actually, the Tower of Babel story, that's encoded in the tower card. I think that's what you're seeing. You're seeing a Tower of Babel scenario happening right there in the tower card. And the other thing I'll say that's really interesting to me is that I've recently read, maybe over the last year, several different correspondences for Libra, the actual imagery of Libra, the object that corresponds with Libra that I wasn't aware of before. One of them is the sword. That the sword basically it's a substitute symbol for the scales. This is why you see Lady Justice always holding a sword. So the sword divides, right? And so the scales weigh, the opposites or whatever. And I even have some tarot cards where literally that sword is acting as the vertical axis for the scales to actually be weighed. Right. And so there's something about the sword that implies that it's impartial. It's related to truth, justice is blind, things like that. One of the other symbols, though, that relates to Libra that I found to be interesting is literally the Tower of Babel that I read in at least one resource, and I've been meaning to just do more research on it. But there's one Christian sky map that supposedly depicted Libra not as scales, but as a tower, right? This is interesting because of the symbolism of the Tower of Babel, the 7-tiered nature of the tower, and then Libra actually being the 7th sign, and Libra being the middle sign, basically, essentially. So it's the central sign. So I think that if there is a sign that very clearly corresponds to me now, I wouldn't have said this a year ago or even 2 years ago or anything like that. But I think that if there's a sign that clearly corresponds to the world axis, I actually think it's the scales. It's Libra itself. The scales cannot function or operate without that vertical axis.
Without that center point. Yeah.
Without that center point. Yeah, exactly. And there are some fantastic resources that I have that say that there's an ancient Chinese secret society that used to refer to Ursa Major and Minor as the scales, essentially, and that the world axis literally was that vertical point that the
It
scales
either
kind of pivot
connects
on.
the upper and lower parts of the chart, the day and the night. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
interesting. Yeah.
So what caused it? I don't know. But I bring up the Tower of Babel story because it was an act of God that caused people to migrate away from the north and potentially away from this consciousness. Was it a catastrophe? I could see that. Was there some sort of reset? I could see that. But I'd love to know your opinion.
Well, I mean, I read somewhere that the Tower of Babel was a technology,
Mm.
and that it allowed people to understand one another through one common language. That it
Ooh.
wasn't as if they um, spoke one language, but it was a device that allowed them to communicate um, in the same thought space together,
Wow.
right? And so that when it was destroyed, they didn't have that technology anymore. So they could have already had different languages that they brought to the tower. But once they were in the space of the tower, they could understand one another. That's what I have heard.
Interesting.
Yeah. So when that was gone, they didn't understand each other anymore. Right.
Mm.
I think the shift away from the polar age is the introduction of the moon. That's what I think.
Nice. I could see that. Yep, that lines up with some of what I'm talking about with these potential three ages, for sure. I absolutely can see that.
Yeah. And because there is literature that exists where there is no moon in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
And through oral tradition, there are tribes from Africa where they'll talk about the sky, zero mention of the moon. And then once the moon theoretically is in place, everything changes, right? And there's this weird correlation between moon cycles and Saturn cycles, 28 and a half days, 28 and a half years. And it's almost as if the moon is usurping Saturn and sending us into the lunar age. And now all of a sudden we have tides and who knows what other forms of catastrophe that were put in place once. Because when I think of the moon astrologically, it almost feels artificial to me. And I read for the moon because we've adopted the moon, and it becomes symbolic of our family and history and memory. But you could, if you wanted to, like if you were talking about the feminine, it's not a big stretch to interchange Venus and the moon.
Yes.
Right.
Correct.
Like
Yeah.
like you could use Venus as a communication for a lot of those same attributes, right?
Mm.
So the moon to me feels almost artificial in some ways. It's like we found a meaning for it, before there was a time where we needed a meaning for it.
Mm. Yes. Oh, yeah. I found the exact same thing with the moon. And so anyone who looks into it enough, there's so many anomalies with the moon. It's just like, how do you make sense of it? You've probably heard of this book before, but I have a book called Who Built the Moon? And they go through all of the different anomalous things with the moon that kind of don't make sense. And so it makes you think like, well, who built it? Who brought it here? What was its purpose? What is its current purpose? David Icke has his whole thing with the Saturn moon matrix, for what it's worth. But yeah, that totally lines up. That's a fantastic answer. I like your answer better than my answer. And I'll say that I think potentially that these ages, these three major symbolic ages, are actually encoded in the tarot. And so you have the star card, right? So stellar symbolism. I think when you look at the star in the star card, you're looking at the pole star. Oftentimes it's actually surrounded by 7 other stars, or it's literally a 7-pointed star itself. Following that, you have the moon card, and then following that, you have the sun card. And so the sun card has a young child on it generally, or it has 2 young children on it in front of a brick wall. And so to me, it's kind of signaling that this is the most recent age. This is the youngest age. And so this is in contrast to this older age which is more primordial and related to the feminine, related to the stars and everything else. I also think it's interesting that the star card comes right after the tower card, which to me is a clear sort of world axis polar symbol. And so there's a relationship between the tower and the star card. But those three cards in a row, it blows me away that they're in sequence of each other, and it matches this sort of thing. It also matches a lot of Freemasonic tracing boards where you have one pillar that's solar, you have another pillar that's lunar, but then you have this other third pillar. And a lot of times it has the Eye of Providence on it. And to me, this is it's symbolic of a polar tradition, of a more primordial age, which again, I've been saying, I think it's more of it can be referred to as a stellar sort of age or a stellar tradition as well. And I've seen Freemasonic tracing boards where the nearest pillar, so they're playing with perspective, the nearest pillar is solar, the pillar behind that is lunar, and then the pillar behind that would be polar. So it kind of fits in line sort of with these different degrees too, from oldest to more recent. But I love that, the introduction to the moon. So what are your thoughts, I guess? Do you have any thoughts beyond that about how it came to be, its sort of introduction here or anything?
I mean, the best case scenario is that it probably was, probably inserted here, right? Because it feels completely artificial to me. And we could spend a whole show, just kind of breaking down the moon.
Yeah.
But it just feels really artificial in a lot of ways. And I don't know, there are times when you can see it in the night sky and it's huge and looks a lot closer than it's supposed to be. And it takes on all these different shapes and characters depending upon its position and the atmospherics. But I've never been moved by the moon. This is just me personally. Like I've never sat down and just gazed at the moon and said, "Oh my God, look at that!" Right? I don't. It's not really been a very interesting. I mean, at times it's interesting, but it's not been a very interesting celestial object for me to kind of ponder. I feel like it was probably inserted here, and if you play with the David Icke theory or some of these other theories, it's part of the soul trap. Right. Mm-hmm. Like, it keeps us in this kind of, eternal feedback loop. Right. And whether or not you want to ascribe any value to the word, but I believe in Egyptian, the name of the moon is Sin. Right. I mean, that's another name for the moon is Sin. Right. And I'm like, oh, well, if that's true, then what does that mean? Does that mean that the introduction of the moon was the beginning of a fallen age? I mean, because if it's true that there was the Saturnian world that we were living in prior to that, and there's a relationship between maybe Saturn connected to the polar world, and then the introduction to the moon, when you look at like biblical ages, right, everything begins to fall off. That at one point in time, if we're playing with this idea that Saturn was part of the polar age, we're dealing with a very different kind of light source. The Earth was probably super oxygenated. Everything was big, right? People were big. Insects were huge. Everything was huge. Maybe the Earth itself, as we knew it, was larger than our current understanding, right? And then all of a sudden, this other object shows up. Then we have these stories of floods happening everywhere, and those floods are they're archetypal, they're universal. What causes the floods? And now we have tides and we have these different cycles that we're in, and it feels a lot like the fall. That's, to me, that's what the moon represents. It represents this moving away from something that theoretically was more Edenic, and even the demonization of Saturn kind of plays along with this idea that, oh, well, that was a bad age, or that's a bad planet, when in actuality it was probably much more closer to an Edenic realm that we might understand. And then we have this introduction to this other object that changes everything, right? It changes everything about this world. So to me, it's sort of the introduction of the fall, right? And maybe that, and we think of also, and I'm just riffing on this now, I've never really given it much thought, but we think about Eve as being this kind of agent of the fall. Well, where do we notice the moon the most? In the evening, right?
Right. Yeah.
So now we're, and when again Saturn was theoretically the sun, it was sort of like this perpetual kind of twilight on the planet, right? Perpetual twilight. And with the introduction of the moon, now all of a sudden we have cycles, phases, darkness, and right, and and it's the setup not just for the lunar age, but also the solar age, because then the sun has to get activated, right, in a way that had not been activated before, not in that sense. So to me, you look at the moon. The name of the moon is Sin in Egyptian. We noticed it in the evening, or Eve, and it represents I think the fall of a certain age. So that's my kind of off the cuff riff theory.
Oh, I love it, man. I'm so here for it. You're blowing my mind right now. Because I mean, it really makes a lot of sense from everything that I understand already. Let me ask you this. So have you also noticed, because this is something that I'm just like really intrigued with right now, is the similarities. You mentioned the similarities between the moon and Venus. It's all there, as well with Saturn. That's all there too. A more curious thing for me as of late has been the moon's relationship with Mercury, and how there's a lot of parallels and overlaps. So as an example, Thoth, the Egyptian Thoth, he was a lunar deity. He was a moon god, right? And so sometimes you'll see a little monkey ape, symbolic of Thoth, right? With a little crescent on his head. And then,
the crescent.
Right. And then the actual glyph for Mercury has that crescent as well, the horns. If you just remove the horns, by the way, then you have the glyph for Venus. So there's that relationship and parallel there. But I've seen there's so many parallels. The moon oftentimes being related to, obviously travel cycles. It's always moving unto itself, right? With its, waxing and waning and everything else. It's been compared to an ark or a boat or a ship of some sort. Mercury is a traveler. He's a messenger of the gods. He goes, to the realms above and below. By the way, in my estimation, he uses the world axis to go from above to below. I think that when you see the caduceus, that's actually what you're seeing. You're seeing the world axis, and you're seeing energy go up it. There is this idea that when energy goes through the world axis, or this bridge, it's kind of like a toroidal field where there's this spin to it, right? And so I think the caduceus is symbolic of the world axis. I think when you think about Kundalini energy, it's a very similar thing. I think our spine is a correspondence for the world axis. But lunar symbolism and mercurial symbolism, there is just like a lot to chew on with how they relate to each other. Is that something that you've kind of noticed as well, or done any research on?
It's really interesting. I've got a Moon-Mercury conjunction in my chart, so I should have some insight into this, but I haven't really spent a lot of time with it. But now that you bring it up, silver is a really important element or color in both, right? So the moon is ruled by silver, and Mercury is a silver element. So they both share silver in common, right? Like Mercury isn't silver, but in whether it's solid or viscous, it is silver in color. So they share silver together, which I think is quite interesting. And Mercury in that regard is fluid, right? And the moon is clearly fluid, right? And it rules fluids in this realm. So there's definitely overlap between the two of them. And somebody brought up, well, if you get rid of the moon, what rules Cancer? Which I thought was an interesting comment in chat. And I was trying to work with that in my head. So you have overlaps with two signs in our zodiac, right? So there's one planet for two signs. That would be Venus for Libra and Taurus, and Mercury for Gemini and Virgo. One of them could wind up being a rulership for Cancer, right? One of them could be, and I don't know which one it would be, but one of them could be. Um, but you bring up a fascinating question about Mercury and the Moon, and how they clearly are related, and they both represent very different things symbolically. Like Mercury, in its purest sense, is logic and reason and rationality and the power of the mind, and the Moon is, clearly emotion, instinct, memory, things that are nonlinear, right? And so when you put the two of them together, like they do form a composite whole in some ways, right? So it's fascinating. The two, like I said, I've got a Mercury Moon conjunction in my chart. So for me, just as a being, right, how I think and how I feel are interconnected together. They're not separated by degrees. It's a really, really interesting question. So the question then I throw back to you, right, is if we took the moon out of the equation, this thing that theoretically represents all those things that we just talked about, emotion, feeling, familiar patterns, etc. Could we exist symbolically without that? Is there enough juice in Mercury, right, to convey that portion of the moon that you bring in with sort of that crescent at the top of the symbol? What are your thoughts on that?
That is really fascinating. I'm pretty biased. I, like so many other, I guess, people who are interested in esoterica and magic and things like that. I have a reverence for Mercury, and I tend to see Mercury kind of everywhere. And so, in a lot of ways, to me, it seems as though Mercury has really been used as a substitute, literally, for spirit or ether. And so it gets really tricky because for a long time, when I was researching all these signs, as an example, over the years, I'm researching Aries or something, and I'm like, okay, that's kind of curious. I'm like, Aries is ruled by Mars, but I see a lot of mercurial symbolism, even to the point where some expressions of Mercury, like I believe it's Hermes Creophoros, if I'm not mistaken, he's holding a lamb or a ram, but he's a symbol of Mercury, and there's a lot of shepherd symbolism with Aries as well as with Virgo. But Mercury has been known as being a deity of shepherds and things like that. And then I move on to let's just say Cancer or whatever, and I see a lot of mercurial symbolism, even the Chariot card, which traditionally corresponds.
Total mercurial symbolism.
Absolutely. I even have some decks. One deck in particular I'm thinking of by a brilliant symbologist. Her name is Barbara Walker. She created a deck. She's written several books on symbolism, but she put Mercury right there at the front of the chariot, and I just thought that was really well placed, And so she's identifying the mercurial relationship with the charioteer and the chariot itself. And so it seems like no matter what sign I'm researching personally, I see a relationship with Mercury. And so after a while, I'm like, wait a second, why is Mercury related to everything? And I'm like, that's its thing. I think that's kind of part of its role. There's different words for spirit, and there's different words for what you might call ether. Some people have an issue with that word. I personally do not. But when people refer, as an example, like there's some Satanists, when they refer to Satan, they're actually just referring to spirit. Voodoo, that's just another word for spirit. If you're talking Star Wars, it's the Force, And so Mercury has been this planet, this expression that encapsulates all of these things, because it seems as though, there's everything here is almost like the liminal space in a way, right? That you need kind of a catch-all phrase to kind of put everything underneath its umbrella, that kind of identifies and brings together all of everything in totality, including the things in between everything. And so to me, Mercury would have enough juice to do the job, to put it the way you phrased it, because it really, I feel as though if there is a sign that to me just gets me going and is kind of an expression of everything in totality, and this could just again be me being biased. I think Mercury does a really good job of just kind of like bringing all different types of threads and myths and symbols together in a way. So that's kind of my answer. But
Well,
what do you think?
when you think of, say, again, Cancer, we think of water and emotion and memory. Well, Mercury is fluid as well,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely, exactly.
And that's the one of the great alchemical mysteries, right? Is this thing that's a fluid and it's a solid simultaneously, right? And Mercury is total, and it is the force that connects all the other planets as well, right? Because it travels between all the various worlds. So you can't really have a relationship with anything without Mercury.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, exactly. So I would even say too, with my research and everything else, that there are deities that were once polar in nature that became solarized over time. And so there's a classification of deity that really doesn't get talked about. It does, but it doesn't. And that would be a polar based god, and I think that Mercury fits the bill, as a polar deity from my point of view, basically. And so that's another reason why over the years, as I've gotten to know Mercury and its different expressions and everything else, I'm like, this is really so powerful that I've always just naturally have gravitated towards it, especially as of late. But yeah, exactly. It's fluid. It's also related to the phallus and rigidity and the pole and the post and all of these different types of things. So it is what people say about it. It's related to this androgynous sort of idea. It goes back and forth. It can be black, it can be white, it can be feminine, it can be masculine. And there's a triune nature to Mercury as well. Kind of encodes the Trinity. So even when you have these two halves, that in and of itself creates a third sort of thing, if you want to think about it that way. Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes.
Even when you look at a thermometer, which contains mercury, right? Which direction does the thermometer move in?
Right.
It
Yeah,
moves
exactly.
north.
Right. Yep. That's it.
It doesn't start at the top and go down to the bottom, right? It ascends, like the thermometer ascends.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it's mercury inside the thermometer that is part of the ascension process.
100%. Yeah, exactly. Another thing related to the north that I was going to mention earlier is a thread that I've been pulling at lately is this idea that a lot of mystics and like in Freemasonry and other lodge systems, they make a thing about the Orient, the mystical Orient, and that old knowledge, old information comes from the Orient. And now, obviously, when I think of the Orient, I think of the East. Most people would. Referring to the Orient or people as being Oriental is like an outdated sort of thing. But it harkens to this Eastern sort of origin, right? The thing I've picked up lately, especially from this author, his name is Henry Corbin. He has this book called The Man of Light, and it gets into a lot of really deep mercurial symbolism. And basically what he says there, and it was just blowing my mind, is that when mystics refer to the East, it's not the East that you can locate on a map. It's actually the North. He refers to it as the cosmic North. It's a Hyperborean concept. It's a sacred center sort of concept. And so once I heard that, I'm like, holy cow, this puts a lot of other things together, including the fact that sometimes that pillar of transcendence of the world axis in, Freemasonic tracing boards, a lot of the times, most of the time, from what I have in my collection at least, it's indicated as an Eastern location. So for a while, this was kind of confusing. I'm like, why is the pillar of transcendence, this clear sort of stairway to heaven, why is it associated with East? Because you'll see East, North, South, and West. And it's because the East, or this Orient, isn't an actual place on a physical map. It actually relates to this sort of sacred center sort of concept. So there is an old esoteric belief that the East actually is kind of a substitute symbol for the North as well. It's a Hyperborean thing, which
if one uses the compass to orient oneself, right, and you have the compass with the true north, that would make total sense.
Exactly. And that's what he says. He says that literally Orientalism, the Orient, is a reference to orientation. And you can't have orientation without the North, because the North gives you that perspective of what's above and what's below. Without that world axis, everything is disoriented, basically. So you need that central location, which is the point of transcendence, which would be the North, in order to be oriented. And as we know too, the main star for early seafarers was the North Star. If you knew where the North Star was, you knew where you were going.
That's right. Lyle asked, what was the name of the author of the book?
Okay, so yeah, his name is Henry Corbin, and the book is called The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism. And that's another thing that I'm just really tripping out about right now. There's a lot of polar northern hyperborean symbolism in esoteric Islam, which I didn't realize until maybe within the last handful of months, 8 months or so. And so to me, that's a really, really intriguing thread that I'm continuing to pull at. But that book really gets into it.
So I haven't seen it in a long time, but have you rewatched The Polar Express lately?
No.
So that's the movie with Tom Hanks. It's all animated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
And it's on this train that is headed to the north. I haven't seen it in a long time, but of course it always makes the rounds during the holiday season. And I'm just wondering if it'd be worth rewatching under the premise of something that you're talking about.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Well, that's the other thing. Where does Santa come from? He's from the North Pole, so he's probably, he is the most popular kind of in your face polar sort of expression that we have in the modern world. Literally comes from the North Pole.
And he's writing that down. He's an interesting combination of Jupiter and Saturn, right? Because Santa, you get Satan in Santa, and Saturn has been connected to Satan. But as a persona, he's jovial, right? He's big, he's generous, he gives out gifts. That was a shift as well, because Santa wasn't always like that. And there wasn't always a Santa. Santa really comes along mostly in the 20th century. The whole idea of Kris Kringle and this, some of the older versions of Christmas, or some of them are absolutely bizarre.
Right, yeah.
You get versions of child abduction in some of those earlier versions, right? It's fucking weird. But the one that we know of now with Santa and the North Pole is this hybrid of Jupiter and Saturn together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I recently did a post, and I was really connecting Santa with Saturn, and I posted some images of Kronos clipping the wings off of Cupid, and Cupid is sitting in his lap, and Kronos has a white beard. He looks very Santa-like, actually. He's not big and round like Santa. And I contrasted that with an image of a child in Santa's lap, crying and wanting to get away. Because a lot of these Cupid figures, they're crying, they're terrified, over what Kronos is doing, to them. And so I was making that connection between Saturn and Santa, which is obviously there, but no, 100% though, yes. I see the Jupiterian sort of influence there as well. And I kind of noticed a handful of years ago too, I was like, man, I was researching a lot of stuff with Aries, and I'm like, this reminds me of Christmas symbolism so much. He's wearing red. When I think of Aries too, obviously I think of war, and I think of, conflict and aggression and things like that, these Martian sort of ideas. And Santa comes through a fireplace, right? And I think of the toy soldiers and stuff. I'm like, how did toy soldiers become a thing for Christmas? And so there was a lot of different things that I was kind of noticing with Aries, and I see Aries being related to the Emperor card and being related to Mars, and I think that there is a correspondence there with Jupiter type stuff, this warmth, as you were saying, that Santa brings. The other thing I'll say too, it's interesting, the seven stars of the north that I always go on about, right? There's been many correspondences. So the Vedics, their seven sages are called the rishis. They say they come from the north. They even have a direct correspondence for each rishi and the star of Ursa Major. And they also have a correspondence too. A lot of older cultures have this too. In China, I've seen diagrams that do the same thing, where they actually correspond one of the older seven planets with each star of Ursa Major as well. And there's a ritual, actually. It's like a star stepping ritual where you go from star to star in Ursa Major that corresponds with the planet. And this is kind of like an ascension sort of technique, an ascension.
That sounds like Freemasonic and Mormon.
Oh yeah, I don't know about the Mormon part of that. That's interesting though.
Yeah, that's fascinating about Santa and Aries and some of the correlations. I could see that. Last week I posted on Twitter, the ultimate Christmas movie is Santa Claus Defeats the Martians, which is
that's funny. Yeah,
there's your Aries. He actually goes to Mars and defeats the Martians.
Nice.
So there's a little Aries reference there.
For sure.
You know, it's really interesting, this idea of Kronos and eating the young.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of somebody like Klaus Schwab, who happens to be an Aries, by the way.
Oh.
And what has happened over the last 3 years with COVID and all the mandate stuff with the masks and everything that's gone on since 2020, and this idea that part of this very demonic ritual was to eat the young, right? What are they? Like, these kids are born under Pluto and Capricorn. So now we have the Capricorn story, we have the Kronos story, we have the time story, right? And it feels like a very targeted generation.
Right.
By these Kronos-like characters who want to devour that generation.
Yes.
Because they are the biggest threat to their hegemony.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's a direct parallel to me. I recently talked about, and I have to thank Tracy for making me aware of this. She has a book called Money Grows on the Tree of Knowledge, I believe is the title. And she has some reproduction images in the book of Saturn cutting off the legs of Mercury with his scythe, and all of the alchemical meaning that kind of comes from that. But she was comparing it to money and debt and the monetary system that we currently have, and how it's the old feeding off of the young, essentially, the youthful and everything else. So yeah, I see that for sure. What I was going to say also too, or it occurred to me, the link between Aries and Christmas, Christ is a Capricorn, if we go by the sort of official narrative. So right. he was born during Capricorn season, during this time of year when we celebrate Christmas. Obviously, it's all solstice stuff, in my opinion, right? And then he dies during Aries season, right? So the crucifixion happens during Aries, and Christ, being a good shepherd, the main tool of the shepherd would be their crook, or would be a staff, basically. That's the candy cane, And so to me, I'm just like, I saw all these different things with the color red, and I know that's kind of more of a modern thing, I believe. But I just saw all this Aryan sort of influence. But the other thing I was going to say is there's so many correspondences with the northern sky with these seven stars. It's been looked at, Ursa Major, as the thigh of a bull. It's been looked at as a boar. They've been looked at as a wagon. It's sometimes called Odin's wain. It's a plow. There is an Irish flag called the Starry Plow, and literally it's just the stars of Ursa Major with a plow, behind it. And so it's been compared to many things over time, blades and knives and things like that, which I think is really interesting. The blade of Set. There's a whole thing about Set and Typhon in the northern sky as well. But the other thing that I think is really interesting that I read probably sometime last year was northern indigenous groups referring to the seven stars as actually reindeer as well. So it's seven reindeer, which I'm like, oh, well, that fits nicely with a lot of other stuff.
Well, that gets back to, it's in your backyard, right? Your true north is in your own backyard. That's
You're exactly right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was thinking of Aldebaran as the bullseye. Irish
Yes.
pub, probably with the same name. Yes, there was the Irish Plow in San Francisco that I used to go to and hang out, and it was a
Oh.
true Irish pub.
Oh.
And all the undocumented Irish workers in San Francisco would go there and drink. It's a great place.
Oh, nice. That's
Um,
interesting.
yeah, so today Mars is conjunct the galactic center at
Mm.
25 Sagittarius,
Mm.
and we won't have back at this point for another 2 years.
Oh, okay.
And when you get into Mars in Sagittarius, you get into heavy duty Archer energy, right? And
Yes.
you know, Mars and the bow and the arrow as a weapon of the hunt, right? And that's kind of where we are today. So I was talking about this on the astral weather and how it's really an important time to zero in on your target, right? Like, what is your target? What is your, I don't like to use the word goal, but what's going to be your target for the next 2 years? Because we won't have Mars again in this place. And to your point, right, it's also movement. Mars is the chariot and moving forward. And Sagittarius having a higher goal or moving to a higher plane, right? Because that's where Sagittarius sits in the ninth house at the top of the chart. So I just
Mm.
wondered if you had any insight or anything you wanted to say about this idea of the galactic center and it representing Sagittarius.
Yeah. There's a lot to talk about with that. Actually, it's really fascinating. Well, the first thing I wanted to mention is I think it's interesting that centaur actually translates to bull killer because you had just brought up Aldebaran being the eye of the bull, right? So centaur means bull killer. The tar in centaur is the same tar that you see in Target, right? And it's interesting that even I have to riff on this briefly, but the store Target, I don't know if you've gotten into this or you've made these connections on your own or whatever, but the symbol is a bullseye, right? So it's
Right.
a target itself. And then it's interesting that the mascot for Target is a bull terrier. And then they to me, that's not a mistake. And then they put a bullseye, a red bullseye over one of its eyes, right? And so to me, that's all very curious and kind of just worth considering and pondering. And also, too, the way Target does their logo, it doesn't have more than one ring. It's one ring with a dot right there in the middle. That's
Right.
the circumpunct. That's the godhead. It also looks like Saturn from the top down. That's the other thing that I kind of think about with that symbol, the symbol of the sun, right? The glyph of the sun, very Saturnian, kind of related to what you were saying earlier, by the way. I sometimes wonder, was Saturn the original sun or was it the original pole star? You know, when I think of this original alignment, I wonder if it actually was the original central star, which the sun could have been the original central star too. But something to kind of maybe chew on or think about. At least it's interesting to me. But yes, this point, this galactic center point, I recently purchased a book called Galactic Alignment. And the reason why I purchased it is because I'm looking for any book that mentions the polar tradition. And so it's like, if it's out there, I want it, you know? So I purchased this book, thumbing through it, reading through it. And this fellow, his name is John Major Jenkins, I believe.
Oh yeah.
He,
He's passed away. He's gone now.
I don't know anything about him actually. Is he
So
reputable?
so John Major Jenkins had a hot feud with oh god, I'm drawing a blank on my brain right now, and I shouldn't be. The Jose Arguelles. So he and Jose Arguelles had a hot feud going on up to 2012, right? Because John Major Jenkins was a long count person with the Mayan calendar, and Jose Arguelles basically reinvented the Mayan calendar. He stuck himself inside the Mayan calendar, and so his version is called the Dream Spell, and he's such a fascinating character. Speaking of time and Chronos, he saw himself as Paco Votan, being the modern reincarnation of the Lord of Time, and so he took his day sign and stuck it at the beginning of the new calendar, which was the dream spell. So he and Major Jenkins had an ongoing feud around the Mayan calendar. And I'm not aware of this book that he wrote about the Galactic Center, but it was fascinating because he came at the whole Mayan thing from more of a archaeological and kind of slightly anthropological tradition, right? Like he looked at what was there, connected with the artifacts, and tried to interpolate what they were all about. Whereas Arguelles is like, fuck it, I'm starting a new system, right? And they're two very different characters. And Arguelles wound up outliving Major Jenkins. So he is an interesting guy in the sense that he was kind of fighting for this traditional version of the calendar. So I think he's worth reading for sure.
Okay. Yeah. To be honest with you, I'm not familiar with either of these guys. John Major Jenkins, I wasn't familiar with him either. I was just Googling polar tradition and I came across his book. It was really cheap. I bought it. And he says some interesting things that kind of fits in line with what I'm understanding about stuff. And he thinks that there was a polar tradition, a primordial tradition that was centered around the northern sky, the pole star, and all these things that we've been talking about. And he says that over the long shift from polar to solar, that the center of the heavens shifted as well. And the center of the heavens was in the northern sky in the polar age, but in the solar age, and I guess it's debatable what it was during the lunar age, but under the solar age, it shifted to the galactic center that you're bringing up right now. So literally, this center point moved from the north to where it currently is, which I think is interesting. And the thing I've also picked up from other resources is that it seems as though Ophiuchus, what it's been described to me as, and what I've read, is that Ophiuchus is something of an exit outside of the zodiac, away from the zodiac. I've read that it's compared to a bend in a river that takes you in a different direction. And from everything that I'm putting together with kind of how I tend to perceive things, that Ophiuchus being located in between Scorpio and Sagittarius, it's hearkening back to an actual polar tradition. So it's more northern than the other signs on the ecliptic, which is why people, a lot of people don't include it. Obviously, there are people who do include it, which gets into another thing. I have a question that I want to ask you after this, just regarding the nature of astrology in 2023 and 2024 and everything else. But that Ophiuchus is essentially pointing you to the direction of the north. And you'll actually see that the serpent head that Ophiuchus holds is literally looking towards the north. And that the symbolism attached to Ophiuchus is basically saying, hey, there's an older tradition, and it might very well be pointing you to this earlier sky clock that is Ursa Major going around the pole star. So that's kind of my quick take on it. But what do you think about Sagittarius being right there?
Before we go there, I just wanted to bring something up around Target.
Sure.
Target is located and incorporated in Minnesota, which is the north. Minneapolis. Right. That's where Target got its start, which I think is kind of interesting. It's about as far north as you can get in the United States without going to Alaska. What do I think about the Galactic Center being in Sagittarius? I think it fits, particularly because it's looking across the ecliptic to Gemini, which is theoretically where the target is, right? And one is a unifying principle, which, if we think of, this is is polarity the same thing as duality? And I would argue that it's not. Right? Duality is Gemini. So there's two options, or there's two poles, right? Polarity would be one pole. That's so they're not the same, right? So you would have something in Sagittarius that would illuminate the duality in Gemini, which could then create polarization, right? So but it does make sense to me that it would be at 25, 26 Sagittarius, but that's moved over time, right? The Galactic Center has not always been at 25, 26 Sagittarius. You could go way back into the sky clock and the galactic center would have been in Capricorn, which would have put it into, right, Saturn.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, that makes total sense. And that was something else that I've picked up over time, is what John Major Jenkins was saying, was that basically the axis shifted from the northern pole to the northern sky, and then now it's what you're saying, exactly right, from Sagittarius.
Actually, I have to I've got my astro math backwards. It's moving towards Capricorn. It is not moving away from Capricorn.
Ooh.
So that said, could we be returning to a polar orientation with the galactic center ultimately moving into Capricorn? My bad.
Oh, no worries. That's intriguing. Either way, I think that it's a curious thing. But one of the things he echoed that I've picked up over time as well, and I've met other people who aren't, crazy about the polar thing like I am, and aren't as biased as I am about all this stuff, say that it seems as though a lot of symbolism that was once attributed to Ursa Major, the 7 stars, were shifted to the Pleiades at some point, and that the Pleiades is close enough to this axial sort of alignment. So if somebody were to say that that the galactic center, or that sort of the main axis or throughway, is from Antares to Aldebaran, do you have any issue with that? Is it close enough for you, or is that too far away?
No, it's close enough.
I think it's close enough too. And so the 7 stars of the north, a lot of the symbolism shifted to the 7 stars of the Pleiades just above Taurus, and that there's this new axis that was created, but a lot of the symbolism was kind of retained with it. So I think that's kind of a curious sort of thing.
It is a curious sort of. Well, we were living in really amazing times, in spite of all the just garbage theater around us, right? We're living in really amazing times, because I mean, you can just see like the flux and the transition in play. Like, one day Trump's off the ballot in Colorado, and then 3 days later he's back on, right? And these things they're theater, but they also are representative of a reality that is really fluid right now. And there's very little like cement that sort of binds where we are in time. And for some people, that could be really disorienting, really, really disorienting, because there's no reference points, right, that they can hold on to. But on the other hand, if we can learn to navigate without those reference points and be a bit more fluid and navigate with these strange currents in our reality, it could get really interesting.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. Related to this is kind of what I wanted to ask you. You had made a post or tweeted something about 2024, or maybe you were talking about a longer period of time, but being like the war of the astrologers and like war of like these different systems and stuff. I find that to be very fascinating. I've kind of explained how I tend to approach things. So whether you're tropical, sidereal, or 13 sign or not, or whatever, it doesn't change my relationship with these signs. It doesn't change my relationship with the symbolism with these signs. So I'm good with whatever. I don't have like a hard line sort of stance with things. I know there's people who are like, if you're not incorporating a fucus, you're not using a real system, or if you're not doing it this way, you're not using a real system. So there's a lot of animosity there. So when you posted that, I'm like, I think I know what he's talking about, but I just love to hear your take on that, because I think that's really intriguing.
Yeah, well, first of all, Pluto will have some ingresses into Aquarius, and then finally by the end of 2024, we'll have the final ingress into Aquarius. So Aquarius, in my estimation, rules astrology, and Pluto will make everything more intense, right? So if you are an astrologer or you have a deep interest in astrology, Pluto will amplify that intensity. So if you feel a certain way about a certain school of astrology, doesn't matter what it is, it'll be your ride or die, right? So you'll have a lot of people that will be because the other side of Aquarius is Leo, right? And so you can't separate Aquarius out from Leo. And when you get into Leo, you get into ego. And so there will be a lot of people very invested in their system being the correct system. That's number one, right? So you'll see the war of the systems. Number two, it is a space that is getting exponentially more crowded by the day because it's becoming more popular. And when you have that, you'll see people that will try to get signal to noise. They'll try to get clout, right? They'll try to separate themselves out from other people doing this thing. And so that in and of itself tends to be an aggressive act, right? So they'll demonize, or they'll what's the word I'm looking for? Marginalize somebody else or somebody else's system so that they can push them down and get a leg up on them, right? So part of this is the density of the space. Part of it is the intensity of Pluto and the magnification of why people get involved with astrology. Because Leo is the shadow, right? Leo is the sort of the dark, unenlightened end of this axis together, and then there's just this sense that in general people are going to be looking for more quote unquote empowerment, and because the system that we're currently cycling out of is incredibly depersonalizing, right? It's just really depersonalizing. And the kind of the upside of that in some ways is that it manifests in Aquarius, and that the personalization of the system is secondary or tertiary to this recognition that we're connected to like this kind of greater whole. But that's being kind to what's going on. But when you have a system that's being depersonalized, the reaction for most people is to amplify the personification of who they are. So that gets also back into the Leo part of it, right? So you just add all those things together, and it's like, here come the thunderbolts and lightning, right? The lightning and thunder that's going to happen in the astrological community. And I feel like, I mean, you can already kind of see this, right? Like with, people taking shots at the Hellenic, system of astrology, and people taking shots at Placidus, and it's just getting started, right? And it's going to be fascinating to watch, because ultimately, one of the things that theoretically astrology gives people is like, it's like the most baseline and fundamental idea that you have secret knowledge. You know what I mean? It's like, and then once it becomes ubiquitous, once it becomes something that the general populace has a working knowledge of, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's dangerous, like it just becomes sort of another thing. And that's a good thing, and it's a bad thing, right? It's a good thing in that everybody has access to it. It's a bad thing because the people who hold on to that and want to be kind of miserly with that knowledge, they'll do everything in their power to maintain and retain control over that system, right? So that's a whole other kind of part of this story, and that you have a number of people who are kind of at the top of the food chain, in astrology, and it'll be interesting to see what they do to hold on to their positions, right? So that this very democratized or ubiquitous system, which is available to everyone, ultimately doesn't threaten their ego, their position, their standing, or even their economic model. So that's what I see brewing. That's what I see coming. And I can feel the aggression on Twitter, right? I can feel it in a lot of ways. And even at times myself, I can see what's going on, and I can go, this is kind of bullshit.
Yeah.
Right. And not the fact that there are people that are involved in trying to flex on Twitter, although that does happen, by the way. But for me, and maybe this is a separate subject matter, but what I see is sort of the Leo pattern of astrology on Twitter, which is people constantly talking about their aspects, or people constantly talking about their transits, or referring back to what they've got in their chart. And I just see that, and I'm like, why do I care?
Yeah.
Right? Why should we fucking care about what's going on in your fucking chart? And some astrologers are good at it. And what they'll do is they'll connect it to some other thing that somehow makes the conversation more about a bigger topic and less about them. But they're still doing it, right? They just found out kind of a more generous way of talking about themselves. So I see all this stuff going on. I'm like, there's trouble on the horizon here. It's brewing. So that's my take.
Got it. Thank you for sharing all of that. And yeah, I see what you're saying. I actually probably the platform where I guess it's kind of debatable, but where I have the most followers at least is actually TikTok. And so my videos, I make them for the phone. And so they're vertical. It's not widescreen for YouTube or whatever, which means that I think there's far less people engaging with my work probably on YouTube than other places like Instagram and TikTok and whatever. But that composes most of the comments that I get is what people are talking about with their own charts. When I post something about anything related to any of this stuff, people just relate it to what's going on with them, and that's pretty much it. And so I don't personally care either. So I see exactly what you're saying.
I just think it's a deeply personal cry for meaning. I'm here, I matter, these things are important to me, and nobody's paying attention. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, right? I get it on a personal level. I totally get it. And they're trying to break through, signal to noise. But on the other hand, it's kind of like, well, what are you going to do with it?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
What are you going to do with it? Do something with it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I don't follow too many astrologers, to be honest with you, but I've always appreciated your take. So this was a huge pleasure for me, and I'll be following along. And I want to listen to more of your opinions about how this is kind of going to be unfolding here, because for some reason there's something here that I need to understand, because I'm kind of a person where I like to understand all of the systems. I like to understand the different ways. So almost kind of like a syncretist in a way, wanting to know at least what I can about the different mythologies of the world and things like that. So I feel like I'm more of an observer than anything else.
Well, I like the fact that you're playing center field, and you're taking in all these different influences, and you don't necessarily have a set position with any of them. But I also don't feel like you're a fence sitter, because you dive into things and you're connecting dots in a really interesting way. So yeah, man, I loved having you on the show. We'll have you back on again. Maybe we'll do something seasonally, and we'll when we get into the cardinality of springtime, we'll have you back on and we'll talk about that stuff too. How's that sound?
Let's do it, man. I'm into it.
Okay. Do you know Ursula, by the way, from Portland? Do you know who she is?
Yes, I do.
She wanted to say thank you for having Mario on the show.
Oh, that's awesome. Right on. Yeah, I mentioned this before the Old World Florida chat, that I had a friend that was singing your praises, and because she had gotten a reading from you, and she said that you were amazing. And so that's my friend Ursula. Yeah, she's great. Ursula is incredibly unique. Am I right? Oh, yeah. Totally. I've known her for years. Yeah. Broken bread with her many times, been to her place. We have a lot of mutual friends in common that you would probably get along with, actually, interested in all this kind of stuff. But yeah, she's so fantastic.
Cool. Well, Mario, thanks again for being on here. Check out his website, Symbolic Studies. There's a bunch of really good materials there. If you want to get a tarot reading from him, he'll do that as well. And, I'll see you on Twitter, Mario, okay?
Sounds good, man. All right, take care. Have a good one.
Okay, bye for now.
Later.
Okay, that was Mario from Symbolic Studies. And I'm just going to do that. Here we go. I got a jam. I got to go be on another show here with Beth Martins. I think Steve has put the link up inside the chat. So if you want to go check that out, I'll be there in about an hour. Anyway, thank you for being here. And the last Friday FARcast of 2023. Next week, we'll have Russ Winter back on. Of course, Russ being on the first Friday of every month. And it truly will be winter. It'll be our first winter show with Russ, official winter with Russ Winter. And we'll have a lot to talk about. There was a shooting recently in Prague, one of those shootings, right? And I think Russ got some cell phone pictures, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll have something to talk about. And that's just happened in his own backyard. I will be back on Sunday night for Sunday Night Astro Live. In the meantime, I wish you all a blessed weekend if I don't see you over on Beth Martins. And have a wonderful day. And thanks again to Mario from Symbolic Studies. Great show. Loved having him on. And you know the drill. Use your head in order to discern what's real, your heart to step what's possible. I'm Robert Phoenix, and bye for now.